But I do want to introduce somebody that is very dear to my heart. He's a very good friend, a huge supporter of the museum. Through really rough times, he's always been there. We could always count on him. The distinguished Dean of the School of Architecture at UTA, Don Gatzke.
Good evening. Terrific to see everybody here. When Chris asked me to give this lecture, first thing I told him was, I'm not a Wright scholar. I'm not a particularly knowledgeable expert or academic on Frank Lloyd Wright. And I wasn't quite sure really what I might talk about. And then at about the same time that I was trying to figure out what I might say about Wright, I got into a discussion with a couple of other people about Arlington. And I made this statement that Arlington, particularly the area that's sort of the central Arlington around the university and around downtown, is going to move into the 50 to 60 year window of sort of nostalgia, reevaluation of the past, and the kind of sense of value that drives preservation movements in other cities. And we don't normally think of American suburbs as areas of historic preservation, of historic value. Probably that's not what most people would think of in terms of Arlington. But in fact, in a very short period of time, I'll predict, and this is the argument I was making, that you're going to see newspaper stories about the significance of Arlington as a neighborhood, as neighborhoods, as an area that has an incredible cohesiveness in terms of its architectural style, its architectural value, and that the neighborhoods of which I'm going to talk about some tonight are going to be seen in the same way to a new generation, the way for my generation, the Victorian house, the craftsman cottage of the 1920s. And it's certainly happening in places like Dallas, in perhaps slightly older neighborhoods, with the interest in mid-century modern. And Arlington trails a little bit behind that in terms of time period, and so that window of historic significance is going to move over Arlington. And so that's why I titled this a semi-cheesy title called Right Here in Arlington. Now, I'm going to have to figure out exactly how I'm going to do this, and I think I probably just will stand back here. I hope this is very informal, and if I go on too long and I start to look around and people are starting to go to sleep, I'll just stop. I'm also perfectly happy if you have a question to just raise your hand or wave or just ask the question. I don't really mind being interrupted. Frank Lloyd Wright, a couple of interesting things. He was born in 1867, and he was not born as Frank Lloyd Wright. He was born as Frank Lincoln Wright. His mother's maiden name was Lloyd, and when he became an adult, he changed his middle name from Lincoln to Lloyd. It's not the only thing that he sort of shaded in his history. He was a character. He was not necessarily the nicest person that's ever populated the earth. Might come back and talk a little bit about that. But I think one of the things that's interesting about Wright is he was 30 years old by the turn of the 20th century. We tend to think of him as kind of the quintessential 20th century architect. Is this working? Is everybody here? Okay. We tend to see him as a kind of quintessential 20th century architect. But he was really a 19th century person. And he espoused and brought forward in his architecture things that are really characteristically of Americana, the American nation in the 19th century. He was the descendant of Unitarian ministers and remained sort of within the fold of the progressive movement of Unitarianism. It certainly embodied his, or it got embedded in his social outlook. He really came of age not long after the era of Thoreau and Emerson, Walden Pond. The sort of embodiment, again, of American rural ideals, the sort of individual development, the perfection of the human spirit that was part of 19th century America, what is generally considered the sort of transcendental movement, that there was a relationship to nature, that truth was to be found in nature. But once you found it, you could understand the principles, and you could start to remake those principles and reimagine them and use them in a productive manner that would elevate the human spirit. We would be made better people if we understood the principles of the natural world. He was born in Wisconsin, which isn't insignificant. The Midwest in the post-Civil War era was generally considered to be the kind of the cradle of the American spirit, of the new sort of the new society. The East was very much still considered to be part of sort of European culture, European sort of influence. The South was coming back from the Civil War and was still identified with agriculture and slavery. The West was unsettled, it was too raw, it was too dangerous. And so where much of the philosophical and political thought was originating in the United States was coming out of the Midwest. And Wright gets born into the middle of this. The Republican Party, which was the progressive party in the 19th century, was founded in Wisconsin, not far from where Wright was born, about the same time, well, 10 years or so before Wright was born in 1867. Wright is incredibly popular with the public, as probably is evidenced by you all being here. There's probably no other architect that anybody could lecture on that would draw as large and as diverse a crowd as you all here tonight. And for most people who are not in the profession, Frank Lloyd Wright is the architect. And he certainly is the most famous American architect. He was an iconoclast. He was an invertebrate self-promoter who would remake his history. He wrote and publicized himself throughout his career. He tended to run away with clients' wives. And that had a serious implication on his career. He borrowed money from people with no intention of paying it back, and then got angry when people asked that maybe it would get paid back. And so he was at least a rascal, and as I said a moment ago, he really wasn't that nice a person. But yet he has this image and this reputation that is certainly larger than life. For architects, he's sort of a problem. In part because he so defined what architects are supposed to be like that it makes it kind of hard to, you're not going to live up to that, and you probably don't want to. And I probably shouldn't, if I'm actually a responsible professional, to act like Wright did, which was if the roof leaked and you were sitting under it and you complained, his solution was move your chair. Don't bother me with the details, and don't bother me with your petty concerns about how the architecture that I made for you somehow is in conflict with what you do or what you want to do with it. And S.C. Johnson, Johnson's Wax, did have a house designed by Wright, was at a dinner party. The roof was leaking on his head. He called Wright up, and Wright's response was, well, move your chair, and everything will be fine. People think that probably architects in the U.S. know a great deal about Frank Lloyd Wright, that were educated in all the nuances of Frank Lloyd Wright. I actually went to architecture school in Wisconsin. Wright was the last person we talked about. And a lot of it has to do with, I think, this kind of battle with his image and his legacy in terms of all the other aspects of architecture which he sort of overrides and dominates. He's not had, other than where you see elements of his architecture in other buildings, his actual legacy is not very strong. There are not many architects who are really descendants of Frank Lloyd Wright in terms of his legacy or his style or his design ideology. E. Fay Jones, architect in Arkansas, who died a decade ago, was probably the best and the most well-known of any of his direct descendants of people who were trying to imitate or advance the architectural language of Wright. He really, now let's move on here. Let me see what's going on. Okay. Wright really had three careers. They're very distinct and they're recognizably different. His first career is really about 1890 to 1912 or so. Chicago, prairie-style houses, Oak Park, Illinois. The prairie-style houses are recognizable. The sort of sheltering roof, the horizontal proportioning system, but they're clearly much more identifiable within a kind of more conventional architectural language. The Winslow House, 1893, is his first independent commission after he left the office of Louis Sullivan, and then his own studio and house in Oak Park in 1898 comes fairly quickly after. This is some of the best examples of what's considered the prairie style. The Robie House, Oak Park, 1911. It's probably the most famous of the prairie style era of Wright's work. And you do see a dramatic change between the early, so the 1893 and the 1911. It does look much more modern, looks less reliant on a traditional architectural language. The strong horizontals, the breakdown of the wall between interior and exterior, kind of mixing of what's inside, what's outside, and what is very hard to actually imitate is the combination of strong horizontals and then vertical articulation that you see in the windows. Taliesin, Spring Green, Wisconsin. This is his studio. It dates from about 1911. He started this, then ran off to Europe with the wife of one of his clients, spent a year or so in Europe, and then came back to Spring Green. While he was gone, away from Spring Green, a janitor went berserk, killed his mistress, Mima Cherry, several other people, and burned down Taliesin. Taliesin West in Scottsdale is the next era, the third of the three careers. Wright spent his time in the 30s, 40s, and 50s moving back and forth between Wisconsin and Scottsdale, Arizona with the seasons. And the mid-career work, which was where we'll come back and look more at this in detail. Again, it has strong horizontals, but it's a more aggressively breaking down the wall of glass structure, inside, outside, innovative use of materials, and very strongly anchored into the site. Falling Water, probably the most famous of all of Wright's houses, 1937, done for the Kaufman family, and one of the interesting things about Wright and his sort of dominating personality is the site, which was a waterfall and majestic rural site. The Kaufman family was in the habit of coming here to spend weekends. They would camp here. They would have picnics here. They said that this was their favorite place in the world. They told exactly where they liked to stand, and Wright came and put a house down right on top of it. He did integrate it nicely with the landscape, but there is a certain conviction or a certain arrogance that one might see in this when the favorite place of the client is the place in which is eradicated by the act of building the house. Last third part of his third career is really late 40s and into the 50s. Guggenheim Museum in New York City is probably, again, the most famous of that era's buildings, and it was completed actually after his death. And it's a fairly dramatic change from what you saw in the first part of the career, the second part, and the third part. Let me take a little bit of an aside and talk about single-family houses, because that's what I'll come back and talk in more detail about. I'll make the argument, and this is greatly simplified, that there's really only 3 or 4 antecedents to the American single-family house. One is the New England salt box. Cape Cod cottage comes under a couple of different names. It's really basically 4 rooms up, 4 rooms down. You add it out the back. It's very much attuned to the climate of New England, where it's cold, snowy, and when you're inside, you really want to be inside. When it's nice out, you can be outside. Then there's the center hall, or what's also is a dog trot, and it shows up in a variety of different ways, from things like a real dog trot to the southern farmhouse with the center hall, or the southern plantation with a center hall to it. The center hall functioned for ventilation and cooled the interior during the hot summer months, and then the porch provided also shade and additional living space. Then there's the Western Ranch House. It's low, small, has a porch, adjusted to the climate, and is attached to the ground. And part of the reason why it's attached to the ground is we don't need, in the south and in the west, you don't need basements. So you can do slab on grade, or you can build down low to the ground. And many of these houses originally started as sod houses. They were literally kind of built up out of the ground. And then the last is the modern open plan. And this is an image of falling water, Wright's house, in which the spaces are not broken up, the functions are not broken up into individual rooms. It doesn't have the regular pattern of the Southern Plantation or the New England Salt Box. Spaces run one into the other. It's much more informal, and it's much more flexible in terms of how you furnish or use it or inhabit it. So I'll make the argument that basically what now we would see as an American single-family house is built out of those precedents. Then in terms of suburbia, which is where the single-family house flourishes, the antecedents of suburbia really go back to, we can take that back to William Penn and his plan for Philadelphia, the colonial era, in which people would have a townhouse and then they would have a plot of land outside of town which they could have gardens and raise animals, and you existed in both the center city and then out on the fringes of the city. Then there's the 19th century streetcar suburbs of, again, of places like Philadelphia, in which the center city was much denser. It was a place of commerce, and the business owners, the merchants, the industrialists would move to the suburbs and build a streetcar from their sort of semi-rural location, home, and be able to commute into the city. By the turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, excuse me, when Wright is really starting to come into his maturity, people are beginning to get worried about the state of cities and industrial urbanization. Things were getting too dense, things were getting too polluted, the economy was shifting where people were moving from rural areas into cities, and the cities were seen as places of disease, of both physical and sort of social dimensions. And so in various places within Western Europe and the US, reform movements started to spring up in terms of what are we going to do with the industrial city. Ebenezer Howard in 1902, English, publishes a material on what he describes as his garden city concept, in which people were going to leave the congested large metropolitan areas and move out into rural areas in much smaller settlements that would be much more like small town living than what you might imagine as city living. And this is his diagram for the garden city. And if you look at it carefully, it really does sort of lay out and locate in a diagrammatic way, not necessarily as a physical plan, but a diagrammatic way, what all the components we would need in order to live a complete and fulfilling life outside of the city. Other strategies for dealing with urbanization and urban development included things like the Radburn plans, named after the first place where it was actually implemented, Radburn, New Jersey, in which single-family houses would be located on greenways, on shared common green space, with service drives that access essentially the back of the house. And most every city that had some development in the late 20s and 30s, somewhere there's probably a Radburn plan neighborhood. The Greenway Park in Dallas is the one that's around here, and it's the closest one that I know of. Then there's the European modernists who had incredible influence, and I have to admit that most architectural culture, even in the U.S., really has been influenced much more greatly by European urban theory and architectural theory than by Frank Lloyd Wright. And so this is a plan by the architect Le Corbusier in about 1931 for the renovation of Paris. It's called the Ville Radieuse, the Radiant City, and this is what he was proposing would replace large sections of the city of Paris. He probably didn't mean it literally, but Corbu, or Le Corbusier, was as equally a self-promoter as Wright was, and they got into a kind of an argument over what was the nature of human settlements. And Corbu came to New York and said, the skyscrapers are too small, we need more of them, it's just not big enough. And Wright, on the other hand, took the opposite trajectory and answered Corbu's Ville Radieuse with the Broadacre City. And the Broadacre City was, and I have to be clear, it wasn't intended as a suburb. It was intended as a complete alternative to any city. And in his vision, anything that we would know of as a city would have dissipated, would go away. And it would be replaced by these settlements, which are very thinly settled, but incorporate agriculture, commerce, industry, variety of housing types, everything you would need to live within a fairly close distance. If you extended Wright's Broadacre vision, probably the entire U.S. continent would have to be settled at about this level of density in order to accommodate the population. But it was intended as a provocative, it's a polemic. It's a piece of propaganda for a certain set of ideas. And even though it's not promoted as a suburb, in fact, it's anti-suburban because you can't have a suburb if you don't have cities. This notion of moving out of the city, moving into a neighborhood in which you've got a certain amount of autonomy, you've got your piece of ground that you can use and develop and live on as you wish, that it might still have a connection to agriculture and to rural life, that it still embodied the idea of the frontier, of being, me in my house on my piece of ground, is something that is found in the Broadacre City and migrated into the American suburban kind of ideal or mythology. If Broadacre City as an idea had been extended to the North American continent, Wright proposed that we would call it the United States of North America, or Usonia. And that was to distinguish the peculiar or the individual characteristic of the U.S. of North America from the rest of America, and not to be confused as to what you were talking about. So let me come back to Frank Lloyd Wright now in specifics. And the characteristics of Wright's residential architecture. I've already said it's horizontal. And again, being overly simplistic, if something looks horizontal, it's probably sort of descended from Wright. If it looks more vertically massed or organized, it's probably more influenced by the European modern movement. And I should also say that Wright was very influential in Europe, more influential in European architecture than he ever was in the United States, in sort of his direct impact. Again, Robie House, just to repeat that, the strong horizontals, the dark line that picks up those horizontals, an integration into the landscape in which the procession from outside, from the public realm to the private realm on the inside is broken up in a series of spaces and a series of movements. You follow a procession that gradually brings you from the public to the private interior. Organized around the fireplace or the hearth. The notion of fire, of warmth, of the kind of primal aspects of gathering around the fire as something that would reach back into our primitive natures, but then extend us into the future in the more sort of perfect, transcendental human beings that Wright really believed his architecture could produce. He was very interested in the use of materials and unconventional materials. He was a technologist. It's part of the reason why his buildings don't last or didn't last, required a great deal of maintenance, tended to leak, because he was pushing the use of materials. These are part of the textile, this is one of the textile block houses that were primarily built in Los Angeles, and again in the mid-20s or so. This is the Ennis House in Los Angeles, 1924, and this was a new building material, new strategy for building that Wright pioneered. Come to the true Usonia houses. This is the late 30s. This is the Jacobs House, Madison, Wisconsin, generally considered the first Usonian house. And Wright is now trying to move more into the middle class, housing for the people, architecture for the people. There is a sort of socialist agenda here that everybody, certainly as social democracy, everybody would have the benefit of living in a Wright house. So the Usonian houses tend to be much smaller. They were inexpensive to build. They used a lot of prefabrication. But they do have the characteristics, again, of Wright's general architecture: horizontal, frequently a flat roof, although not all the time. You can see the evidence on this one of where the fireplace or the hearth would be, the anchor of the house, the center of it, and also the sort of manipulation of the entry sequence in which nothing is quite direct. It's informally organized. It's not axial, it's not symmetrical. It's supposed to represent the sort of informality, or not represent, I shouldn't say represent. It's supposed to create the informality that is part of modern American living. Another 1940, strip windows. The walls don't go all the way up to the ceiling, and that helps sort of break up the wall so it doesn't look like inside, outside. It starts to fudge that sense. It also helps him bring the light in on the inside in a way that makes that dematerialized wall work both ways, outside looking in, inside looking out. And again, you can see where the hearth probably is, where the heart of the house is located. mansion house, again, another one in Wisconsin. Strong horizontals, set into the site in a way that it doesn't sit on the site, it sits into the site. You can see probably where the fireplace is, and you can imagine that from the outside looking in and the inside looking out, you're not quite sure where I am with respect to the larger world. Just another variation of it. There are quite a few of the Usonian houses. There's also quite a large number of purported Wright buildings in the world, of people claiming that their house was designed by Wright. There are more Wright houses than Wright designed. Wright was also very good about recycling things. So a project would not get built, it'd go in the drawer. Somebody would write him and say, would you design a house for me? Wright would say, yes, I'd love to design a house for you. Tell me everything about yourself that you need to. And they would, and then they'd go in the drawer, pull out the drawing, send it off, and say, this is exactly for you. Minnesota Usonian house. They do vary in size, from 1,500 square feet or so to over 3,000, from sort of very small, almost starter homes to much more sort of elaborate. But again, you'll see the use of materials in a unique way, nothing that's really particularly traditional. Smith-Stein House, 1950. This is one of my favorites, just because I love the wall and the large sheltering roof.
How much natural light is in these houses? Some look very dark, and then some look like they have a lot of windows.
Surprisingly many, but
Okay.
surprisingly a lot. But the play of light and dark, that some places would be dark, like around the hearth, and then other places would be very light, where you turned away from the fireplace and you looked back and you could look out into the yard, into the garden. It was very intentional. So these, when it's closed, it's closed. When it's open, it tends to be very open. 1956, the Mallika House in Milwaukee. Looks fairly conventional from a kind of 50s suburban perspective. Kentuck Knob in western Pennsylvania, 1956. This is getting towards the end. This is actually very close to Falling Water. So if you go to Falling Water, you can go to see Kentuck Knob as well. This is, I think it's still owned, but it was owned fairly recently by Lord and Lady Palumbo, and a British industrialist who has made a hobby or a passion out of buying and restoring significant works of architecture. They own houses all over the world, and they own the Farnsworth House in Chicago, which was Mies van der Rohe. They own houses by Le Corbusier in France, and they own Kentuck Knob. In the mid-50s, Wright started to get into prefab and worked with Marshall Erdman in Milwaukee to do some what was intended to be some very low-cost builder spec houses. And there are not many of them were built, and there are not many of them left. This is another Erdman prefab. And again, you start to see the elements. Yes?
What does prefab mean?
They were, portions were pre-assembled in a factory, trucked to the site, or materials pre-cut to be installed. So when it got to the site, it was sort of a kit of parts that could get put together very quickly, very cheaply. Just to look at a couple of interiors. The free plan or the open plan, spaces that merge together. Usonian houses were intended to be occupied without the benefit of servants. That was one of the selling points. So they were intended to be very efficient. Kitchens were integrated into daily life. You didn't go off to the kitchen, disappear from the family, and then come back with it served at dinner. It was all part of the activity that would occur in the house. And you can see, I think, Julie, how the light is manipulated, where you get expanses of glass that lets your eye escape, and then other places in which it's dark and it's intimate and warm, and you're supposed to feel like you are in the nurturing embrace of the interior. He also, in his sort of authoritarian nature, wanted to design all the furniture, all the fabrics, what you would put on the table, what the silverware was, and if you didn't follow his prescription, you really weren't serious about, you're not serious about living in a Wright house. This is Samara, which is the exhibit here. Now, when I was thinking about putting this lecture together, and I was going to talk about the influence of Wright in Arlington, there were half a dozen houses around that I went, okay, I'll go take pictures of those, and I'll make a case for those, that here's how you could see the influence. And as I did it, and I did it with my wife, Diane, who's back here, the more we looked for Wright-influenced houses, or houses I could use to illustrate the point, the more I found. And the more that our sort of frame of reference got tuned to looking for it, we started just coming across whole blocks of, and whole neighborhoods in which it just seemed to really kind of leap out, to the point where I had to eliminate. We started getting really picky about which houses we would include, and I have many more slides than I have time to show, or you have patience to look at. And so, but what I want to do here is sort of change the frame of reference by which we look at, and at least I have, and maybe I can convince you, to look at the older neighborhoods, those mid-century, the 50s, 60s neighborhoods of Arlington, and to make the case that these are valuable contexts, these are valuable fabrics, architectural fabrics, that not only will people will start recognizing as being very attractive, but are worth preserving and worth looking at in terms of preservation. And I'm not going to say preservation ordinance. I don't want anybody to jump up and say I'm trying to impose. I'm just saying we should be looking at what we have with a certain critical eye and recognizing the value that exists in the broad fabric of these neighborhoods, not necessarily in any individual structure. Now, actually, there are no Frank Lloyd Wright houses in Arlington. There is one in Dallas. It's in Preston Hollow. It's the Gillen residence. It was completed in the late 50s. It's purportedly Wright's last residential commission. And then the other Wright building that's in the region, I don't right now. I do know, but I've forgotten. The Clea Humphries Theater on Turtle Creek in Dallas is a Wright building. It was completed in, again, 1959 or so. Interesting thing is, this was a design for a theater in an entirely different location, I think maybe Kalamazoo or someplace, in 1915. And it was one of the projects in which it came out of the drawer and with a little bit of modification got executed. Okay. This is Center City, Arlington. We are at the Red Star up there. The blue boxes is basically University Precinct. All the yellow thumbtacks are the locations of houses that I'm going to take you on a tour of in my slideshow. So you can sort of see how they're clustered around. This is not in Arlington. This is one of the Usonian houses. Okay? But that is. This is Park Row and Davis Street. Horizontal lines, strip windows. Sort of the dissolving of the barriers of inside-outside. I think if we didn't have the big D up there, you could see where the fireplace is and where the hearth and where the center of the building is. This is Benito Huerta's house. Down the street, on West Park Row, another house, very clearly part of a kind of Frank Lloyd Wright idiom. Long horizontal, sheltering roof, strip windows, expanses of masonry, a sort of informal organization of the major elements. It's not symmetrical, and the door is apparent but recessed, inviting, protective, welcoming, recessive. Again, the Millard House, textile blocks, 1115 Linda Lane on the corner of Davis. This one's hard to photograph, in part because it is so well integrated with the site. But if you go take a look at that, you'll recognize many of the characteristics. Carport, informal organization, prominence of a fireplace, of the hearth, remnants of the use of the sort of textile block, a certain kind of articulation of the surface that is shared with Wright.
Didn't Burrettis live in that house? An architect, and I think he designed that house.
I suspect.
Okay.
And I don't know the provenance of most of these.
Pretty sure that's the one.
Okay. Or around the corner, right next to the previous house, at 1625 Davis. It's maybe a little simpler than the Usonian house, but again, you can see where the fireplace is, the use of masonry, the horizontal proportions, the sort of informality of the approach. They're not always expensive. Got the prefab Erdman house above, and then a very modest house on Cedar Lane. 2307 Wren, it's for sale. I would say probably somebody didn't quite understand the sort of the finesse of how you use the horizontals and verticals. Right? But there clearly is an attempt to integrate this into the site, into the landscape, in a way that you don't see in other architectural styles, except most prominently in Wright. 527 Westview, I think this is one that most people know and sort of and see as a Wright-esque house. I'm not going to keep repeating the elements, but again, it sort of shares all of the major elements. As you get into these neighborhoods, it'll be one right after the other. There's sort of wide and long runs of them. 620 Westview, it's sort of down the street from the previous one. Basically, it's the same form as Kentuck Knob, the big roof, horizontal. Secondary vertical patterning, like in the end wall. The door is recessed, sheltered, in part of the terminus of a procession as you move to it. 1804 2nd Street. 1931 2nd Street. Some of these I've included not because they're sort of orthodox right, but I think that they've got a clarity, they've got a strength to them, and they're clearly there's clear evidence of an architectural hand behind them with intent, not just to stylistically imitate anything, but somebody that had an idea about how to make a house and how people would live in it. 1804 Smith Lane, 2nd Street, Westview, that's all just west of the university. 1908 Woods. If you look at, oh, I just forgot the name of the one, but the one is 1950s, 1950 Wright, and then 707 Briarwood. Horizontality, way the door gets treated, the entry sequence gets treated, the retaining walls that move out into the landscape. 1808 Briarwood. If you discover that I've got some of the addresses wrong, I was pretty good, but there's a few I might have. It's if there's an error, they'll all be on the right on that block. They might be a little bit. The specific number might be a little shaky. 1805 Briarwood. Horizontality, strip windows, high windows, set into the landscape. The proportions of the brick are horizontal. And then the entry sequence. 1813 Briarwood. (1909) Briarwood. Whole run going down the block. Big roof, big shelter, informality, the approach to the front door, use of the natural. It was a public street. I just took it. I was just standing on the street. Very sweet house. 1401 Briarwood. Carport. Door recessed. Evidence of the fireplace, the hearth. Integration of the structure into the landscape. Comes all the way out to the street as part of the architectural sequence. I just like this house. It's probably not the most exemplary of a Wright-influenced house, although, again, it's horizontal. The pattern of the windows is something that is more common with Wright than is with any of the other architectural styles that preceded it. 1917 Sherwood. Sherwood Drive has a whole string of them. 1011 Sherwood. Varsity Circle. A little bit more modest neighborhood. Sense of experimentation in those houses. Not unlike the sense of experimentation that you do see in all of Wright's work as well. I like showing houses that aren't necessarily very expensive, but have an architectural integrity. And I'll make the comparison between Jacob's house in 1937 and 709 Linda Lane, or 1107 Linda Lane. 1204 Woodcrest, really just around the corner from the previous two. 1217 Woodcrest down the street in relationship to one of the Usonian houses. Back to the Usonian, to an actual Usonian house, and then 1401 Southwood. What do you see when you approach the house? You see the fireplace. You see the anchor. You see the symbol and the presence of domestic life. 1619 White Way, just very clean, very crisp. Nice house to work with in terms of in the possibilities of a great renovation. Not that it needs to be renovated. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's a nice crisp clarity to that has some strength and integrity. 1620 White Way, which is right across the street from the previous house, but that and the Usonian house above it, hard not to see the relationships. Then over on Mill Creek, which is sort of southeast of campus, another whole expanse, a whole run of Wright-inspired, Usonian-inflected houses from, I'm guessing, early mid-60s. I don't really know for sure. 2012 Mill Creek, 2013 Mill Creek, 2015 Mill Creek, Bluebonnet Drive. Slightly more modest, I think, than probably Mill Creek. And again, this is not one that embodies sort of the details of the Usonian house, but it's a nice house. But you could look at the 1500 block of Marshallsdale, sort of one right after the other, in which that 50s, that mid-century modern Usonian sensibility is really pretty evident. 1104 Inwood, 1308 Inwood, Lavender, again, both sides of the block, just running down and sort of block after block of them. As you get further into the 60s, the Wright influence gets diluted, it starts to disappear, its other influences start to creep in. It's now been sort of imitated and re-imitated and sort of worked over so many times that it really does start to lose its crispness, and it starts being, in a way, contaminated by other ideas. But when you get all of these together, the sum is greater than the individual parts. 1313 Bluebonnet. I think this one's been worked on. It certainly has been marvelously maintained. 1401 Bluebonnet, across the street. Juanita.
That was my house. 1503. Is it 1503? Yeah, the bottom.
1521 Marshallsdale. Uh, 1514 Camellia. And then 1524 Camellia, I guess that's Davis, corner of Davis and Camellia. Again, just to repeat, sheltering roof, horizontal proportions, presence of the fireplace, integration and landscape. Whoops, and it's obscured, and then the proportion of the windows tends to be horizontal rather than vertical. 1600 Camellia. Then there's a beautiful little neighborhood west of Collins, Meadow Oaks, in which almost every house on the circle has some strength, some clarity, and Usonian Wright influence. This is 945 Meadows Oaks. Has the largest post oak in Arlington. Continuing down the street. The upper one is 945 Meadow Oaks. The one below it is the Mallika House in Milwaukee, Wisconsin from 1955. I forget, it's 9-something Meadow Oaks. There's the fireplace again. 966 Meadow Oaks. Roof, dematerialization of the wall, the sort of relationship inside-outside, unconventional use of materials, the wrought iron fence, done as a wall, not necessarily as a fence, use of masonry materials, wrapped around the tree, integrated into the landscape, integrated into nature. 1217 Colonial Court. You see what I mean. 1209 Windmill Court. Kentuck Knob up above. 1209 Windmill Court below. 1301 Windmill Court. 1305. Informal organization of the major elements, integrated into the site, an informal procession, but clearly defined procession, up to a recessed front door that's sort of hidden in the shadows, but invites you in, and then some proportioning of the secondary elements like the windows horizontally. I really like this one. 1306 Marshall-Dale. Modest, flat roof, Usonian influenced. Somebody's done maybe not the most sensitive carport added to the front of it. It's a little bit hard to see. But in terms of its presence on the street, it's got a certain kind of nobility and it's got a certain clarity to it. And the sense again, of experimentation. And then this is the last slide. I needed to finish with one. I wasn't quite sure which one I would finish with. But 1304 Bluebonnet. And again, it's probably newer than you know, when the Usonian influence was at its height. But somebody has maintained it, and they've added a little carport with some storage in the front, which is very consistent with a Wright approach. It's consistent with the character of the house, and it's taken and expanded on the house, provided some additional utility to it in a way that I think is very consistent with the existing character and the character of the neighborhood. Okay, that's the last image. As I said, what I was hoping to do was to sort of like tune your perception such that if you drive down the street now, you kind of go, oh, gee, I never noticed that, and maybe I should, and maybe all of these hanging together actually is part of our cultural value. It's part of stable neighborhoods. It's part of our cultural and civic history. And it's about 50 to 60 years old. New Orleans, which is filled with historic architecture, right? Nobody would think of not calling New Orleans historic. In 1925, people wanted to tear down the French Quarter because it was a slum. And they couldn't imagine who would want to live there other than, at the time, Italian immigrants. And now we wouldn't imagine doing anything to the French Quarter of New Orleans because it's such an historic fabric. Other neighborhoods in New Orleans are, tourist destinations, highly valued for their character, and all they are simple shotgun houses, one right after the other. They might have a little bit of a decorated front on it, but they're incredibly ordinary. What is their strength is that there are so many of them. It is so repetitive. The French Quarter of New Orleans, people think, is hundreds of years old. By and large, it's post-Civil War. Number of fires in the city, things happen. Most of the French Quarter is post-1865. So in 1925, when people were beginning to argue that the French Quarter needed to be preserved as a cultural treasure, it really was about 60 years old. And the same sentiments were expressed then that we express now about our recent past. Well, it's really not very good, It's not as good as it was, a long time ago. And that's what people thought about parts of New Orleans, parts of the French Quarter. And that changed. And fortunately, there were some people that got out there and said, no, you cannot tear this down. Got the state of Louisiana to create a legislative act that made the French Quarter an historic district, from which all of the historic preservation legislation in the U.S. really descends from. There's some arguments with Charleston, South Carolina. But I'll try to go a little bit on a limb and say the same sentiments that preserve the French Quarter are the kinds of attitudes and the kinds of sentiments we need to start looking at our neighborhood, we need to start looking at in Arlington, and looking at it as something of value that we should at least celebrate and build with, and hopefully, from my perspective, continue to occupy and invigorate and to maintain and to improve upon. So I kept you far longer than I intended to, and you've been very good, and thank you very much. I'll answer some questions.
Some of the high-end luxury homes that he did that were so beautiful, did he influence the Bauhaus, or did Bauhaus influence him? It seemed to me that my understanding was that Europe was interested in what he was doing. Yes.
Yeah, Wright would never admit that he was influenced by European modernism, the Bauhaus, and that was a constant argument between Wright and all the other European architects who really did dominate 20th century. Wright. And that's where it's useful to keep in mind that, like as I said, Wright was 30 years old in 1900. He already had established a career. He's actually a generation older than the kind of the heroes of the international style, Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius, Le Corbusier. He could have been their father. And so the modern movement traces its antecedents to them looking at Wright at 1900, at the Prairie Houses, at Unity Temple in Oak Park, which gets referred to as the first really modern building. And so what he did in his first stage career gets imported to Europe, gets sort of absorbed into the modern theory, and then comes back to the U.S., but he doesn't get credit for it, and he's sort of on the outside, and he didn't get along with anybody. So he's never grouped with he's always put off to the side in terms of his influence on modern architecture. But he did have a profound influence. But it went to Europe and then came back sort of as European modernism.
That same question, or maybe it's a point I just wanted to suggest. You say that he wouldn't acknowledge the European influence, but you didn't mention the Asian influence, which he surely acknowledged and introduced to the architectural public. It's hard to imagine so many of those houses, so many mid-century modern houses have so many Asian design elements.
Yeah, there's an Asian influence, there's Mayan influence, there's Aztec influences. He traveled, he got projects in Japan, went off there, incorporated it. Some of it, the transcendental nature of it, the sort of Zen, the Asian religions, had something that he saw and akin to. Same with sort of Mayan, mythic civilizations from the past that were sort of integrated with nature, I mean, came out of the natural world, were all things that he sort of incorporated. I mean, he is a genius. He was a genius. He's just was sort of one of a kind, and ultimately, other than through, I think, the single-family American house, really didn't have a tremendous influence in terms of his direct architectural style. Other people would argue with me, but.
So before you leave, just indulge me for 2 seconds. Let me thank both Gatzke's, Don and his wife.